Welcome to Was It That Good, a new series where we dive into artists' best albums and debate whether they were actually that good. And we're starting with My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy.
And the question is, was it that good?
Well, Kanye West has released many albums that are seen to be some of the best in rap music history. So we're going to go through this track by track and see if it was in fact an amazing project. Let's start with Dark Fantasy.
The intro being read out by Nicki Minaj in her posh/British voice was prior to Nicki Minaj actually being as big as she is now. So it was a very weird inclusion, but I thought it worked quite well to start the album off.
I thought that this had a very epic kind of feel at the start, a lot going on with the production, and then it kicks in with a very minimalist beat.
Can we get much higher? Can we get much higher? I can't unhear that song. I can't unhear that little bit of the sample. It's great.
But the beat is a proper little head bop when it actually kicks in. It's in between the kind of intro and outro of the track. It's that boo-doo-boo-doo. And I'm just sat there vibing out. I really liked this. And I thought it switched up nice with some clean bars from Ye throughout.
Putting this as the first track on this project just lets you know how phenomenal this album's going to be. In the first intro bit with Nicki talking, you're kind of like, what's going on here? As soon as the beat kicks in with the samples, you just think, okay, this is going to be a work of art.
And then we go on to Gorgeous featuring Kid Cudi and Raekwon.
Raekwon of Wu-Tang fame. So already we're out there with the star-studded features.
And Kanye and Cudi together is just unbelievable. This is peak Kanye and Kid Cudi, maybe, obviously Kid C Ghosts, but just seeing them two on a track instantly gets me excited. And I really liked Kanye's kind of muffled radio style voice effects on this. It switched it up nice.
Cudi and Ye work so well together. I wish we could have more from them after we had Kid See Ghosts. And Ye goes off on this track. Like, his bars are just absolutely insane. Although he does make the fish sticks reference, which bro just needs to get over at this point. I know this was 2010, so it was still somewhat relevant, but he's mentioned it multiple times since then. You know, the South Park episode where it's like, do you like fish sticks? Do you like putting them in your mouth? That whole, do you remember that?
I have no idea what you're on
You've
about.
no idea? Really? That's like a deep part of Kanye's lore. Anyway, he's clearly not over it. He's still talking about it to this day, and I just thought it was quite funny. And there's a guitar part that comes in towards the end of this track that really just tops it off nicely.
Yeah, I think the Raekwon verse and the darker turn of the instrumental was needed at the ending part of the track, and it added a lot. We'll move on to Power up next.
Great use of the 21st century schizoid man sample. I thought, this is absolutely phenomenal. What more can be said about this track? It is just straight power, as the song title would say.
It really takes the energy up. When you see Power as a title, you think, all right, where are we going to go here? It had me vibing. There was some fun bars throughout this as well. A couple jokey ones from Ye that he loves to throw in there. But it was one of the only tracks on the track list that, according to the title, didn't actually have a feature, but it did have a feature. I'm not sure who it was, but it did have someone else in there.
A lot of the tracks have features that are uncredited, but then only some of them are credited. And you think, like, if I was somebody on this album that provided something and saw all the credits, but mine wasn't, I would be a little bit annoyed. But there's a little interesting Easter egg, I guess you could call it, something a bit strange, which is at 3 minutes 20, when he says, so exciting, and it reverbs and it fades out. After he says the first so exciting, it starts to sound like he's saying suicide. And when this album was being written, he was in a very dark place, and there's a whole lore to it where he was in Japan and he was listening to these artists that were about suicidal thoughts and this, that, and the other. So it's interesting to think whether that was purposeful or just like an after effect of the effects on his voice. But knowing Kanye, probably purposeful. And I thought quite clever.
Deeper meanings behind it, and we'll move on to All of the Lights, which did have an interlude as well. I think that this is one of the best produced tracks around. The drums, the trumpets, the bars, the Rihanna singing, it just molds together into something beautiful.
The interlude, let's just talk about that quickly, because that lets you know that Kanye's tracks aren't just rap hip-hop tracks. They can be taken apart and they can be rebuilt as an actual fully fledged song. Like, it just works as a composition almost. And for an orchestral cover of it, it makes you have a whole new level of gratification for it, because you think this is actually a great song just in itself.
From that interlude all the way up to the end, it builds up and down multiple times. We get Kid Cudi in there with some nice singing, and I just think that this song is so perfect.
I adore the drums throughout this track as well, and sometimes these loud kind of abrasive drums can take too much away from the track, but in my opinion on this track they're just at the right level where it just gets to that point where you think if these were any louder they'd be in the way, but everything is so perfectly leveled that it's just seamless. It's just a phenomenal track, and I would argue one of Kanye's top 5 tracks.
I'm not against that. Should we move on to Monster, one of the first star-studded feature lists? We have Jay-Z, Rick Ross, Nicki Minaj and Bon Iver.
And again, like I was saying, Nicki Minaj, this is pre like all of her big projects that came out that made her the artist that she is today, so she really had to prove herself on this track. And I think every feature on this track, everybody's gone out of their way to do such a good job.
Kind of spooky intro though.
A little bit, yeah, a little bit.
Maybe the whole song's a little bit spooky, but I think genuinely this verse is one of the best verses I've ever heard from Nicki Minaj. I think out of this feature list, when you see Rick Ross, Jay-Z, etc., you look at them, especially when this came out, people would have looked at them and gone, them two, they're going to be delivering flames. But Nicki was the one that really took it by storm.
You could tell, like I was saying, that she was trying to prove herself, and she was like, this is my chance because I know this project's going to be big. It's Kanye West. I need to do something. And she pulled it out the bag. Absolutely phenomenal. This track as a whole is just, I really like it.
I think having that many features be able to come in and out and work together well is an impressive moment for Kanye and his levels of production at this point in his career. We'll move on to another star-studded cast with So Appalled.
So we've got Jay-Z, Pusha T, some words and then letters. We've got a couple of them. And then I want to say Sci-Hi. That's what I want to say for that. I'm not too sure how it's pronounced. And then Swizz Beatz and RZA, which was a surprising feature to see.
Again, the layers on the instrumental of this are really interesting right from the get-go. Perk my ears up, get me listening. But to be honest, this track as a whole, I think is much worse than Monster. I think Pusha T delivers some clean bars and none of the features are particularly bad. But by the end of this, I was a little bit bored. I was thinking,
This was a lot more dialed back than the previous tracks that we've heard so far. And I thought it kind of added like a nice break in the album because it's all been very powerful and very upbeat. And this kind of dialed it back a little bit, kind of put a bit more emphasis on the lyricism and the vocals and what were being delivered. But whether everybody actually came with their A game is another question, because some lackluster features in there for sure.
Yeah, it was probably my low point of the album, actually, I would say. For some reason, I just really didn't vibe.
There's a Donald Trump reference in this as well, which was prior to when he became president and was doing any of that. And when he was still just a figure of money in hip hop, like you had Mac Miller who did the Feeling So Donald Trump or whatever it was. And it's just weird now knowing who he is to hear the kind of, because it's positive references, whereas now everybody's like, fuck this guy. Back then everyone was like, I want to be rich like Donald Trump. He's, you know, I've got all this money. And it just very strange to hear. And it kind of dates it slightly. I think when you hear these kind of references that are very in the moment, I get why they do it because it makes sense then. But going back and listening to it, sometimes you pick up on something and go, maybe that hasn't aged the best.
But should we go on to Devil in a New Dress featuring Rick Ross? I've got a controversial statement to start this.
Go on then.
This verse from Rick Ross, this track, is the best thing he has ever done in his entire career.
Oh, that is a very, very, like, apart from Purple Lamborghini.
I think this is the best thing he's ever done, without a doubt. His
enough.
verse on this is clean. The production of the track is amazing. And I think that in a weird way, this isn't a particularly standout song for most people. And I think that in itself is special because this is better than 80% of other rappers' entire discography. Any single song you can pick out from Drake, J. Cole, whoever you want to say, this is better than a lot of those. But on this, it's just an album track.
Yeah, which says a lot about how good this album actually is. And Ye's flow on this really carries the beat. I thought Rick Ross's feature was great, but Ye really stole the limelight on this track, which he does throughout the album anyway. We know he does because he's just phenomenal throughout this. This is when he's at his peak performance, I reckon. And there was a fantastic guitar solo in the middle of this track as well, which again blew it out the park. And throughout this as well, one thing that I really noted was the bass line that was being carried through. It just sounded so... I don't even know how to explain it. It just worked so well. And I know I'm going to keep saying that. It's so hard not to glaze every track on this album. But the production work throughout this cannot be understated. That It's just a work of art.
Runaway.
Runaway.
I've said it before, I'll say it again. I think this is potentially the best rap track of all time. I know that you can go back and use your nostalgia and say, oh, what about Wu-Tang Clan? What about whatever? And I love those tracks. But this, for me, that piano introduction is ungodly. Everyone knows about that. The Pusha T verse is incredible. The Kanye verses are incredible. It just, everything about it, I love it.
I could listen to this track every day of my life and not get tired of it. Like, you see the initial runtime of 9 minutes, and you'd think on the first look at this album back in 2010, if you were to see this album, you saw a 9-minute long track, you'd think, that's a bit of a slog. Like, am I actually going to be able to listen to this whole thing? But by the time you're about 7 minutes in, you're like, oh shit, I've been listening to this for 7 minutes. If you're doing a full track listing from top to bottom of the album, you don't even realize how deep you are into this track until you look back and go, holy shit, this has been going on for ages. It just doesn't, you'd feel like it would eventually get tired or overstay, but it's perfect.
Who got you?
Who got you? What the fuck? I thought that was the name. I was like, that's not a track.
Let's stop glazing Runaway and move on to Hell of a Life.
Hell of a Life, and a hell of a review, if you ask me. And if you are enjoying this review, don't forget to like and subscribe. We do all sorts of reviews, all sorts of genres of music. So please stick around and see what we've got coming in the future.
But for me, this track was a more industrial feeling, Yeezus style track. Obviously, this album coming before Yeezus. I think we can see those influences starting to creep in for Ye here. Really liked this. I thought it switched up the tempo and the vibes quite nicely.
The intro goes so hard, like unbelievably hard. It has me pulling what I like to call a stank face. You know, when you're like, oh yeah, like that video of Jay-Z when he hears a really good beat and you can just tell he's fully feeling it. This track is fantastic. The beat is just insane. It blows your fucking face off. And it's hard to put into words how much this song and this album up until this point hypes me up. It just gives me a sense of energy. It kind of gives me a kind of, it pushes me forwards.
And I think it's very important to say as well, we see a lot of this style of track now, but when this came out, this was a very different type of rap and instrumental versus what was mainstream and popular in that moment. And that's one of the reasons now to this day it still stands up really well. And that's when people have had over a decade to master that sound. I think we kind of see this sound in people like Playboi Carti, Travis Scott, etc. now, but Kanye already had it back then.
The only downside to this track, in my opinion, and yes, there is one, and that would actually be Kanye's flow, unfortunately. I think it doesn't work with the beat very nicely, and the other thing is that the hook is a little bit mid. Wasn't massive on the hook for this track, but I do like the breakdown at around 3 minutes in. I did really enjoy that, but I thought Kanye's flow could have been a little bit better. But we move off that into Blame Game featuring John Legend. What a feature.
This is such a strange track as well. I really wasn't, like, obviously I've heard this album a bunch of times, but I remember when I first listened to it, this felt completely different to every other track on the album, and I really liked the fact that it slowed things down so much. Really long song at about 8 minutes. We even get Chris Rock at the end.
Yeah. Yeah, I forgot that was even there. And when I listened back, I was like, oh no, this is funny. This is fun. Easy taught me.
But exactly, it just makes it a really fun track, but the John Legend vocals are just fantastic. The production of the track and those vocals added in, I can't even get my words out around how much I like this.
I can't help but think that John Legend might have had a hand in helping to write this track, which is why the feel of it feels so different to the previous tracks. But it doesn't make it stand out so much that you think this is from a different project. It still works within the realms. And like you were saying, John Legend's feature is absolutely amazing. There's a bass guitar throughout this track, which knocks it out the park. It feels like they're a lot more focused on actual instruments rather than a beat on this track. But there is panning vocals at around 3 minutes, and they go from ear to ear, and it always catches me off guard because usually I'll be listening to speakers. So if I've got headphones on, I'm like, whoa, he's over here. Oh, now he's over here. I like it when they do shit like that.
And then we move on to Lost in the World, which I think does sound like it's off a different project. Again, very much Yeezus vibes and a massive change in direction versus having John Legend singing in the previous track.
The intro low-key creeps me out. Like I'm just not a huge fan of it. It makes me feel a bit, I'm not huge on it.
I've got the production on this is clearly to a very high level and it's a unique sound, but it's actually one of my least favorites on the album. I think that it switched things up, but not in a particularly positive way.
What I will say is when the beat kicks in, it kind of found its feet a bit more, and I was like, all right, there's some credence to this track. But what I really loved was the rework of the power sample towards the end of the track. You can hear that he's taken maybe the little bit before it with a tiny bit of the power sample, and he keeps using that over and over again. And it's just a nice little callback. A kind of, do you remember that really good song I had earlier in this album? Well, I'm going to put it at the end of this track, just so you remember that even if you think this song isn't great, there is some great songs on this album.
And the question is, who will survive in America?
The transition into this track is amazing, but it almost has me thinking, why was this its own track with all the previous tracks being as long as they were, having these outro bits with Chris Rock, people just talking? That could have just been tagged onto the end, but I guess he really wanted to make a statement with what was being said in this track.
I think that this, well, it wasn't even really a track, was it? It was more of a speech, more of a sampled speech, but it ends the album just with people clapping, and I think, does Ye know how good this is? When he was releasing this, is he like giving himself a round of applause?
He knew already how much of a masterpiece this was, and I can't imagine anybody else that was featured on this album didn't say to him, look, you've got a work of art on your hands here.
Yeah, if you heard this before it came out, you'd be like, wow, this is unbelievable. But Tim, give me some thoughts on the album as a whole.
This is Kanye West's greatest album. Hands down, this is the best album that Kanye West has ever released, and possibly the greatest hip-hop album of all time. Dare I say a contender for the greatest album of all time.
I don't even think this is Kanye's best album.
What's Kanye's best album?
I genuinely...
You're going to say College Dropout?
No, I'm going to say The Life of Pablo.
Well, okay.
I think The Life of Pablo, much longer track list, a lot more unique and different sounds. I actually prefer that as a project.
That's insane.
That may be a criminal take, but genuinely, I think as a whole listenable album, Life of Pablo is better than My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. However, I do think this is still a masterpiece. I don't want to take anything away from this. Production is... I think this might be Kanye's, like, in terms of fine-tuning it and not releasing a half-baked album, this might be his peak. Because from this point, he started, maybe fucking around a little bit. He knew streaming was there. You could tweak it after or whatever. But this, from start to finish, is just incredible.
One thing that can't be understated about Kanye is how much he's contributed to the world of music and how much he's contributed to the soundscape of hip-hop and rap and everything in that way. Every album that he releases is what you could class as ahead of its time, where within a couple of years' time, everybody's doing that style. Everybody's going, oh, I should be doing what he did. But he already did it. He's already done it. He did it years before everybody else did. And then even nowadays, you can hear influences. You got 808s and Heartbreak, which you can still hear influences of. You can hear influences of My Dark Twisted Fantasy.
Jesus, everything,
everywhere.
And I think one thing to shout out about this album as well, so many features, Jay-Z, Pusha T, Nicki Minaj, Kid Cudi, Raekwon, RZA. Getting that many people on an album and doing it correctly is impressive. And a lot of those people at the time, Pusha T, Nicki Minaj, are nowhere near as big as they are now. So kind of scoping them out and getting the best out of them, getting Rick Ross's best verse ever, just works so well.
He just knows. He can see when somebody's going to have potential, and he goes, right, I want you on my project because I know either you're going to pop off or I can see the talent in you before you even proved it to everybody out there. And this album is so meticulously crafted. There's all of the voices that went into all of the lights, all of the different layers in that. He's thought about so much, and you can imagine that he was sat there for days, if not weeks, for like single tracks on this and just kind of perfecting it and getting this bit in and re-recording this section and getting his vocalists in to re-record this, that, and the other. There's so much going on. The instruments and the samples that make Power as good as it was. There's just... It's hard to comprehend how somebody can add so many different layers to a track and still make it sound like it's not too muddy, doesn't sound like there's too much going on, versus when you listen to, for example, let's just say a band with 4 instruments and a vocalist. That works because there's such a small amount of stuff. When you're adding all these extra samples and all these extra layers to then make it into a song that's as phenomenal as it is, it's hard to understate how fucking artistic this is.
And I think in a weird way, going back and re-listening to this and really concentrating on the amount of effort and energy put in has made me more disappointed about recent Kanye West projects, where you can hear snippets of greatness and hear snippets of great instrumentals that never quite make it to their full potential. But Tim, I feel like I don't even need to ask the question, but there is a question, and it is, was My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy really that good?
Without a doubt, yes, it was that good. What would you say?
We're both in agreement there.
Of course we are.
Obviously, after everything we've just said, but there's another question, and that is, many years on, after re-listening, what would you rate this album out of 10?
It literally cannot get any lower than a 9 out of 10.
I've got 9 out of 10.
9 out of 10. It has to be a 9 out of 10.
I've got 9 out of 10, and maybe some people would say, why not a 10?
No.
Because there's a few tracks on here that I think could be improved. There's one or two of the features that I think aren't like God tier. So 9 out of 10 is an unbelievable and very fair score.
It is, and what an album, and it deserves every second of our review.
And if you want to hear more about Kanye West, rap music, rock music, pop punk, everything in the world, album reviews, and more Was It That Good's coming up, remember to hit like and subscribe.
Thank you very much for watching.